Welcome back to another episode of the Sports Card Dad. I reached out to Shawn and we were just talking before. I can't believe it's been 2 years since Shawn was on the channel. Shawn, of course, many of you know Shawn. He's got the Reserved Investments YouTube channel. And I really wanted to bring Shawn back on because he's covering not just sports cards like a lot of what we talk about here, but a variety of different collectibles categories. And he's been in it for decades. And so, wanted to, dive into a few different topics tonight. Shawn, how you doing, man?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. This should be an interesting discussion.
Yeah. We've, well, we were just saying it's been 2 years. So much has happened in 2 years. And yet there's a lot of things that just don't seem to change in the space. And you've probably seen this over a much longer period of time, as I just got back in, 2018. The one video that popped up that it really kind of sparked interest that you did recently was Tom Brady's kind of venture now into card shops and the retail space. And it's interesting. You and I have, we have kind of an interesting nostalgia base. We're around the same age. I think I was born in 81 and I have the 80s, 90s nostalgia geek out, like the whole, I'm all in on all that nostalgia stuff. I see these memes online where it's like, they should turn the old malls into like, Gen X or older millennial, like retirement homes. I completely agree with that. Honestly, if I was 70 years old and I could live, they set up little residences and there's like an electronics boutique and there's a Radio Shack or whatever, and an Orange Julius or whatever the hell, like that would be heaven for me. I would love to do that. So, so you popped out with this video on Tom Brady's store. So he's getting involved in the retail space. And it's not it can't be little. I remember card shops in 1990, whereas literally guys were smoking cigarettes in a cardboard shop. I don't know how that happened, but that was the reality back then for some of the younger viewers. But I wanted to get your take on this because so the first thing I thought of was, okay, is this going to be kind of a high-end boutique thing where maybe he gets involved in a handful, like a Louis Vuitton type thing where maybe there's, a handful of stores, globally. But he said in his press release that he wants to have them globally. And then one of the other founders in an interview said that their goal is to open a store every month for the foreseeable future. And again, these are not in, this is not it's not in a shopping plaza in the middle in a rural town. This is in, high-end stadiums. And, this is across, adjacent from, parks and, all sorts of places. What was your take when you saw this? Just as, somebody that's in the space and consults on trading cards in general?
Well, first I got to bring this up because this kind of goes back to what I was talking about originally on my channel, where when like the billionaire class invests in these markets, they do so differently than the average person. And now we're seeing that a large swath of Wall Street investors have come in these markets, whether they're buying up auction companies, grading companies, whatever it is. They want to get their hands in the antiques and collectibles trade, but they're not doing it like they did in the 1980s. Now, obviously, if we look at the high-end art market, that's always been attractive to investors, people that have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal. But now what they're going after is they want an inroad on the financial aspect of the trade that has access to underlying cash flows. So that's what really this is. This is people who have money coming into these markets, pulling their weight, trying to dictate where the trade is going to go in the future. And as I've said before, it's no longer collectors. It's no longer speculators that are driving the ship. It's high-profile investors. And what's good about this, I will say this, the positive spin on this, it's going to bring more money into the hobby. The bad news is for those that just have a passion for these markets, that just want to collect this stuff with a passing interest, unfortunately, it's going to commoditize these markets even more. And it's going to raise prices as a result. So that's kind of where we are in the year 2025. Everybody wants a piece of the proverbial investment action in all of these markets.
Now, along those same lines, because when we think about billionaire class and we think of kind of individual investors and institutional money and that sort of a thing, the Paulskeen's one-of-one debut patch card that just sold, it got sold to a publicly traded company, Dick's Sporting Goods. So now maybe this is something that has happened all along and maybe it was in the background and it wasn't as public. Dick's Sporting Goods did this as more of a publicity, a marketing, type deal where they actually said we're going to have collectible shops or kind of an extension of our stores where we want to market this thing as almost like a tourist attraction in a way in their PA in Pittsburgh, essentially that they want to have kind of a collectible store. What is that? I mean, first off, I guess, do you think this is a new thing, or is this something that companies have done where maybe it's been a little bit under wraps, is kind of like, hey, we're, like this is an asset that we want to buy? Because to me, this felt like kind of a newer thing, like where a company is going to come in and at least publicly say that they're buying it. I don't know. It was surprising in the trading card world. It was a little bit of a shock to see that now not only are average Joe collectors, trying to compete against big money folks, individuals, but now publicly traded companies are buying cards.
It's good publicity for them as well. And that's really, I think, why they did this. It wasn't so much as an investment. It was more, well, we have the money. We're in this business anyway. Let's do this. It's going to bring people in at least, or at least it puts our name out there for less cost than it would cost, to be honest, to run consistent advertising.
Do you think we'll see a Nike or Reebok, other kind of these sports adjacent companies that have the funds to do this, and also I guess the other part is does it just continue to prop up the higher end cards, because these are all kind of the one of one game that a lot of the manufacturers are playing. This is of course a lot more on the sports card side, the modern side.
Definitely.
The thing that's so shocking, we'll get into Pokemon cards later, but to me, the demand for Pokemon cards without any serial numbered cards compared to sports cards, it's like that they haven't even had to pull on that lever yet. If they ever pull that lever, forget about it. But anyway, we'll get to Pokemon in a few minutes. But do you think that, I guess manufacturers will continue to lean into these, the one of one type cards? And do you think they'll overdo it? I guess that's my thing, because you have a chase card here. Do you think that they'll overdo it to where there's just kind of too many of the chase cards, or, they kind of get out of balance?
I think we're already getting to that point to a certain degree. I mean, it is kind of ridiculous how far we've taken mass-produced scarcity in a lot of these markets. Unfortunately, though, the end consumer doesn't seem to mind, because, again, this is sort of going the opposite end of what happened during the junk wax era. So this is kind of still in response to that. The problem is, if you lean too far in on mass-produced scarcity, you're kind of coming around. It's like a circle, right? You're now coming around on the other side where it's like, well, where do we draw the line here as to how much product we're putting out versus how much the market can reasonably absorb, even if these are so-called one-of-a-kind pieces?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the market's still trying to find its balance. In my opinion, I honestly think it's completely ridiculous, because almost like the amount of glut of just, well, this is a one-of-a-kind refractor card. This card, you know what I mean, just has a signature. This card was done in this manner. It's just too much of the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
The problem is the buying public really hasn't tired on it. So
yeah.
It's working. I hate to say it.
Do you think when it comes to sports cards, we'll just stay on sports cards, do you think a lot of that is kind of do you think most of it is fueled by the nostalgic 35 to, the 50-year-olds? And I fall in this bucket. We both fall into it in collectibles in general. But, do you think that it's mainly just fueled by kind of just, all right, we've got kind of these nostalgic fueled 35 to 50-year-olds. We all have, we've got some discretionary income, and we're, the thing that's very interesting is you need that next gen. You need the next gen to also have the nostalgia. And to be honest with you, when you go to card shows and card shops, they're packed, and there are a lot of young people and just in general. So when I look at it, I kind of think, well, there's probably going to be another generation. Of course, we can't see the future, but what is your thought on just kind of the demographics and how that plays into all of this?
Oh, this is an established market. Make no mistake. Now, obviously, the modern stuff is more speculative. That's a little bit more risky to gauge the future, especially if we go like 10, 20 years out. But this is still an established market in the trade. It's going to continue to grow. So I don't think that sports cards are going to die out. There's other markets, like I would put comic books. And I know this is controversial. Comic books are more in a danger of dropping off a cliff rather than sports cards.
And you're saying that because there's just less people going and buying comic books at the comic store, and the production is different and all that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, if we look at the demographics of younger collectors, of even younger generations, They don't interact with superheroes the way that me and you did growing up, where we would go to the comic book store. There was a comic book store almost in every corner. You would get your latest Batman or Spider-Man. This was at the time during the modern era comic speculative boom, when companies were putting out all these stupid holofoil covers and everything. But there was legitimate demand for those books. Today, we're seeing younger demographics, not to go off on a tangent on this, but when it comes to comic books, they're interacting with those characters either through video games or movies or shows. They don't care about reading the stories.
Yeah. How much of that market do you think is reliant on good movies coming out? You know, you've got, of course, Fantastic Four is coming out this summer. There's a Superman movie coming out this summer. And it just feels like I was speculating on comic books starting in 2018. And it did feel like a lot of it was fueled by, oh, this villain is going to be in the next movie coming up, but it does feel like to me now there's less, and not saying that it's not there, but the reaction to like a movie coming out is less, you know, to where it's like, oh, that's really going to move a comic book. You know, I think people have kind of learned, or they've, you know, maybe they've seen kind of the up and the down, and they're just going after key books of, you know, Silver Age or Golden Age or whatever, and they're less likely to buy into a spec book.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And it is directly linked to the movies. That's why prices got too far out of hand. It got completely ridiculous. I mean, during the pandemic, I talk about this on my channel. The value of just Werewolf by Night 32, which is the first appearance of Moon Knight, that isn't even a major character. It shot up to the stratosphere just because Disney Plus put out a 6-episode limited series and then did nothing else with the character. And I remember I was racking my head against the wall because people were paying like $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 for this book in 9.4. And I told them right after that show's forgotten about, the book is going to come crashing down. And today there's a ton listed on eBay. You can get them for under $5,000 in 9.4.
Yeah.
So that's always been my warning to the comic book collecting community is you guys wanted this to be a thing with speculation on superheroes. The problem is, what do you do when audiences tire on those movies? Prices are going to collapse. The comic book collecting market over the next couple of decades is going to be in jeopardy as a result. And that's what's happening. I'm not saying it's going to die out completely. It's not. I invest in that market. But you can see a downward trend, especially if you look at the demographics, and that's very scary. That's why anytime you link a collectible to the investment potential, and the sole investment potential is what's driving that collectible, you have to be very cautious.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, I've been trying to focus, you talk about graded video games and of course graded comic books. I've been buying both of those things just because it has been a little bit kind of on the back burner. It's not as hot as it was. I bought a giant size X-Men 9.4. I have an 8.5, but I got a 9.4 here recently, in part because it does just feel like, you know, it's kind of cooled off over there on the comic book side a little bit. And for me, that's a good time to kind of add in something that, you know, looks like a good value. So I'm with you there. All right. So with sports cards, I want to go back to the difference between now and the last sports card boom, junk wax era, going back to 1990. You know, Topps has always been a popular American company, but a sleepy company for the most part. If we compare it to just kind of like it was a $500 million company going back a few years. Mm-hmm. Michael Rubin, Fanatics comes in, they buy it. They're making other investments within this space. You have Collectors Universe is now just Collectors Inc., I believe, but you know, they've come in. Nat Turner and that group have come in. That's PSA, and you've got a lot of hobby companies again that are tied into that investment group. Big time investing. eBay, which has always been, of course, big for collectibles, but over the last 5 years, they've really expanded out their operations, you know, to kind of court the new customers and the increased visibility in collectibles. How do you see this? You know, what are, I guess, pros and cons of big companies, some of them public, to where, of course, you got shareholders that, you know, they need to make money, which means they need to invest. You know, it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You know, it's big enough to where it's good to have big companies because the stuff's not going to be irrelevant, because these companies they've got to make their money. At the same time, you know, it typically is, you know, if you're the average collector, usually means higher prices a lot of times across the board for services offered. But what's your take on this? Just comparing it to where it's come, you know, over the last 30 years from this boom compared to the last one.
Well, where we are in the trade, the whole trade is pretty much governed now by publicly traded companies and even privately traded companies. And the problem is, you already hit the nail right on the proverbial head with this, is a publicly traded company is pretty much, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders at all costs. So that actually is a net negative when we look at the effect on the market, because they're putting their profits and the shareholders before the industry by and large, and also the collectors and speculators that are a fan of these markets, or even the average casual collector that's just trying to invest in these markets. So that's a net negative overall. But it is where we are in the year 2025. I mean, this is standard across the board. If we look at auction companies, grading companies, even companies that are on the sidelines through private equity that are buying into the antiques and collectibles trade, we're never, ever going to be able to stop the proverbial train now that it's left the station. Let me put it to you that way. And the government has made no inroads into this. You know, one of the things I will say, you're well aware of what took place with Wada Games, the alleged, what happened allegedly behind the scenes, the lawsuit that's pending. The government didn't get involved in that as far as we know. So at this particular point, really collectors have to watch their own interests and understand that rather than get caught up in the hype, rather than get caught up in nostalgia, you need to understand that there are powerful people pulling the strings behind a lot of these markets. And as a result, if you're going into this just based on nostalgia or based on this idea, oh, look, all these people on the internet are investing in this market, I can make a lot of money. If you don't understand the risks, you're going to get burned. And that's where I have to come in and caution people, where we're never going to get back to where these markets belong truly to collectors. And, you know, we're all holding hands, singing Kumbaya around the fire, going, hey, it's all about the people. We're for the people. And that's how these markets work. We're so far away from that. We're never going back to that. So that's where I'm kind of on the middle. I think if you make an educated choice, and you do understand that on the plus side, talking against now the cons that I just mentioned, on the plus side, at least with all this media attention, all this money throwing through this market, if you make a wise financial decision, you can invest in these markets and it can pay off for you as a result. So I don't think we're ever going to go back to where we were during the junk wax era, where a lot of these companies just say, you know what, let's turn on the printer machine, make it go brr, and just put out a ton of product. But on the flip side, you're going to see a lot of these gimmicks where a lot of the companies kind of start towing the line with mass-produced scarcity, where they just create more of the product in different ways and limit it.
Yeah.
Because they have to answer to these investors, these shareholders, because they always want to see a profit. So it's not going to go back to the way it was in the 80s or 90s, where the whole market's going to come crashing down. What could happen, though, if they're not careful, over the next 10 to 20 years, even over the next 5 years, people can go, you know, this is getting old. They're just putting out different products, limiting the product that they're putting out, and they're really not giving us any value. So why should I keep investing in this?
Yeah.
And that's what makes these markets inherently dangerous. And as we talk about Pokemon, that's one of the risks too that's going to end up occurring most likely in the Pokemon market.
Yeah, we're going to flip over to Pokemon in a second, because you and I think we agree on one thing that I want to touch on, that it's shocking to me that not very many of the Pokemon YouTubers are really talking about, but we'll get to that. Are you a believer? And again, with a lot of collectibles, with sports cards, I always joke about, like, I'm a New Orleans Saints fan, so like I've got my Bobby Hebert cards. I'm not going to retire on my Bobby Hebert cards. It's a common like player. You know, it's not Tom Brady, it's not Mickey Mantle, it's Bobby Hebert. So, but putting those kind of collector cards aside, just cards that I have just to enjoy. But it's something that I'm thinking like if I'm buying something for, as you mentioned, kind of more of an investment, an alternative investment type buy, you know, where the hope is that over time it increases in value and that sort of a thing. Are you a believer that, you know, given the fact that we do have big money coming in, whether that's companies, individuals, that, you know, and I know this is going to be case by case, depending on what modern card, what vintage card, do you believe in what is the phrase, like rising tides lifts all boats type thing, to where if you're buying strategic vintage baseball cards, let's say, or you know, very specific 90s Michael Jordan inserts or something, like kind of key cards within the hobby, not necessarily just any player. Do you believe in that sentiment of like, hey, look, if big money is going to be here and stay here for the next 10, 20 years, that will kind of trend these sorts of things up over time? Or does it not really work like that, do you think, like with collectibles, sports
No,
stuff?
I think that there is a lot of opportunity in the vintage stuff. I've said that before because we already know pretty much the supply. It's finite. We know how many are out there. And back in the day, we also know manufacturers didn't purposely limit the amount of product they were making. There was no gimmicks. So if you have a 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle card, yeah, there's a lot of them in existence. Let's be realistic if you look at the population reports. But there's also a lot of demand for that card.
Yep.
It has a special place in most collectors' hearts and in their minds. So I will always tell you the great thing about sports cards. You know, when I look at the antiques and collectibles trade, on one end, you have the antique side of the equation. And on the other end, you have the collectibles trade. What makes sports cards so unique is even if they're not 100 years of age or more, which meets the definition of being an antique, they're somewhere in the middle because at least with sports cards, they're based on real life people. Yep. So it's almost like a historic artifact in a way. So that's why there's a lot of opportunity in this market. I don't mean to sound negative on this market. Where I have a lot of problems with are the modern era stuff that companies are just putting out, pretending that they're rare because they're marketing them in a new way or limiting the supply. Doesn't mean you can't make money in that market. A lot of people do. And that's going to be, unfortunately, the norm going forward. But I think I would argue if somebody's coming into this market that wants to diversify and spend money rationally and intelligently, I would tell them you're better off going after with the cards that are already established from the vintage era. Then if you want to diversify, if you want to go after one of your favorite players, or you want to take a risk, you want to go after one of these one-of-a-kind cards and you want to pay a premium for it, as long as you already have some vested capital in the vintage stuff, by all means, branch out. But I wouldn't put all my money there, counting on it to grow year after year. That's inherently risky, especially now when we do see this big influx of money. What usually comes next is, at some point, the collectors, the speculators, and more importantly, these high-profile investors, they're going to possibly get tired of this market and shift gears to something else. And that's where if you're going after the speculative stuff, you could be holding the proverbial bag.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think it's a perfect segue over to Pokemon cards because yeah, what's hilarious to me, it's kind of like when they talk about vintage video games, and vintage video games are literally what I grew up playing. So it makes me feel really old because you and I basically like were kids when video games were invented, essentially, at least on a, you know, for the mainstream. But, you know, so with Pokemon, and I don't want to say that I watch loads and loads of different Pokemon card channels, but when you look at Pokemon investing in quotation marks, we'll call it, it's really more speculation than anything. Exactly. It's a ton of modern talk. It's a ton of modern product. Many of the folks own businesses. Maybe they've got distributors, and you know they're kind of doing the Rudy Alpha Investments thing where they, you know, they get their supply, they sell off a piece, and God bless them. Like, you know, there's a lot of great business people in that space that are doing well, and I want them to do well. But it's just strange to me that when you're talking about investing, that there is very little talk on vintage Pokemon, which vintage Pokemon is only 1990, 6 to 9, like to 1999. Like, we're not talking about that long ago, but there is very little talk on vintage Pokemon cards. It's not to say there's not demand for it, because there is, and there's people that are spending money on it. I know that you've mentioned you're buying singles, you know, as they pop up. I'm buying them as well. I struggle with buying kind of vintage sealed product only because of, I don't, you know, with CT scanning and everything getting better and better. And also just with the Logan Paul scammy type stuff that I've seen, I'm not in a hurry to buy, you know, first edition booster boxes or anything like that. But I really do like that space though. I want to have exposure to Pokemon. I believe in the long term. I believe in the IP long term, you know, so I want to have some exposure to it. What is your take on, you know, and of course, we're not talking about specific YouTubers by any stretch. I think a lot of them do a good job, but what is your take on just that there's not very much vintage Pokemon talk, or maybe I'm missing it?
No, I don't think there is. It all shifted to modern because let's look at modern. You buy a set today, and literally 3 months, the way the market's going, you pretty much doubled or tripled your money.
Yeah.
And this is my problem with the Pokemon community. They think that's normal. And this is where even Rudy, I give credit to, because Rudy will do a video on this where he goes, this is not normal. You're not supposed to be able, like my background's in finance, much like Rudy. So when he says something where, and this is something we both agree on, where, even money managers, it's like you're supposed to look at your overall portfolio. And if you can eke out a return every year from like 7 to 9%, you're doing really well. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Well, these people in the Pokemon sphere, they think that buying an item for $100 and 4 months later flipping it for 300 is going to be the norm going forward. And that's just not the case. And I hate to say this, this is my problem with the Pokemon community. They forget where they came from. If you guys recall, and I'm going to pick on Rudy with Alpha Investments here, remember the Pokemon bathroom where he put all this stuff in a bathroom because it wasn't performing? Nobody wanted it. Then the pandemic came along, and that's what propped up demand for all this stuff. So now we're in this weird space where there's so much demand for modern product that everybody's chasing what I call the proverbial dragon here. They're going after this speculative stuff, and they're forgetting the vintage stuff. That doesn't mean the vintage stuff is really cheap. It's not. If you look at some of the high-profile cards, and again, I mentioned this on my channel, my 3 favorite vintage Pokemon sets are Gym Challenge, Team Rocket, and Skyridge. Yeah. And if you go after any of the cards, PSA 10 holofoils in any of those sets, you're paying $1,000.
Yep.
Because that's what I like. But compared to how much modern Pokemon is appreciated in value, those cards still look like values. I mean, you can buy them, even paying thousands of dollars. Well, gee, look at what a case of Evolving Skies goes for.
Right.
It's like, would you rather have that, or would you rather have a vintage card that we know almost how much are out there? We don't still know how many people are stashing away boxes and cases of Evolving Skies.
Yeah, you make a good point there. I mean, outside of the Illustrator card, which could probably goes into the millions, there's certain cards, but there's very few. I mean, you could probably say that most of the highest, like the most expensive Pokemon cards are in the couple $100,000, maybe $500,000 if we're talking about like the very top of the food chain, which that is a tremendous amount of money. I don't want to discount it. But we just literally saw on the sports card side of Paul Skeen's 1-of-1 debut patch that they printed up less than a year ago, sold for over $1 million. So, I mean, if you're comparing the two, that's bargain shopping. A lot of this vintage Pokemon stuff, obviously we don't know what's going to happen down the road, and they're 2 different markets and all of that. I'll say that. But when I look at vintage Pokemon and you look at, just some of the stuff, it's like, man, and you mentioned Skyridge, that's a great set where, it's interesting. People don't look at the rarity. It's like they haven't. It's weird. It's semi-established, I guess. The Pokemon space semi. It's not established, but it feels like there's a lot of opportunity there because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of sophisticated like investors. If we're talking about investing, serious investing, it feels like the big money, the serious people that would come in aren't here yet for it, because if they were here, the vintage stuff would be a lot more expensive. That's what it feels like to me.
But then you have a lot of the Pokemon YouTubers talking about how the vintage stuff doesn't have the same feel as the modern era product.
It's not shiny or whatever. It's like,
so it's this weird dichotomy where how many other collecting markets do you know where modern collectors crap on the vintage product? And maybe I'm using too much of a strong word there, but like, could you imagine if comic book collectors were like, well, I don't want that old golden age and silver age comic books. It's like, well, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's strange that you don't have in any, and other collectible spaces and antiques, but when I look at a collectible space, I want the first stuff, the origin story, like where did it come from? I've actually been looking at on the Pokemon side, because I collect graded games as well. I want the games. I want the original sealed games. They're not inexpensive. You've got the red and the blue one, the Game Boy games. Yeah. That's been on my radar, and I'm concerned. I'm like, because they're not inexpensive, but they're not crazy expensive either, the sealed copies. And so I'm like, I need to get a copy. I'm kind of FOMOing a little bit because I'm worried that serious investors will come in, serious money will come in and be like, oh my God, like the games came before the trading card game. How how is there even like games available, like sealed copies? And the pop reports, I think if I look at like the blue and the red, I think maybe there's like a couple hundred of each that are on maybe it's just WADA, but I haven't looked at CGC. Maybe there's more, but point being that, there's not thousands of these on the pop report total that have been graded. Now, there could still be a lot of sealed copies out there, warehouses and all that stuff. So who knows? It's risky. But that's something where I'm just like, man, I would like to in 2025 see if I can at least get one of those. So anyway, I threw graded games into the conversation.
No, that's fine. What really tarnished the demand for those relics, though, to be honest, is the fiasco with WADA, with what happened in that market. Because there were some investors that were going after that stuff. I can tell you, I do have clients that go after that stuff. But it just seems to me, with the people that I work with, they kind of pulled back when that happened. Because it was like, oh, this really isn't organic. You know what I mean? It didn't give you warm and fuzzy feelings if you were putting money in that market and now a lawsuit surfaced where, hey, we want to look into some of these allegations, whether they're true or not, no one knows.
Yeah.
But if you look at the way that market was developed, there were a lot of people, myself included, that were cautioning people, be careful with this right now.
No, totally. And I understand that. But I think that because graded games is in a weird spot too, where even though they've been grading games, of course, with VGA going back in time, but it's not really established. It's very, very new. It's basically like, 1990 grading sports cards is like where it's like 1995, like it just kind of took hold here over the last 5 years. So I'm kind of looking at it from the standpoint of whether it's WADA or CGC or whoever the grader ends up being. It's still the actual item itself that I want, regardless of whatever it's sitting in. Like I think in 20 years, maybe it's something completely different as far as the grading company goes, but it's the items that are still like, that I think are still going to be all right. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, and that's something where it's kind of like, oh, if there's some bad press, maybe that'll suppress prices and I can get, a better deal or something. And, I still want to try to get one of those. We'll see though. We'll see how it goes.
That's fine. It is a niche market at present time. I will say
it's that. It's super green too. It's very new. Graded video games is not something that's been around for a long time. So, yeah. All right. So TCG, Pokemon. And we also have, so on the sports card side, we have a lot of sports card people that are upset because Pokemon dealers are taking over sports card shows. So now it used to be like 80-20, like 80 sports cards, 20 Pokemon. And now it's like 50-50. And people are like, what the hell? Like,
they're following the money though.
It's wild. Yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely wild. Now, do you go to trading card shows? I know that, you go to different kind of conventions and things like that, but do you go to trading card shows?
Occasionally, yes.
How is it? Well, I guess you've got the Philly. You're in Pennsylvania. I don't know how close you are.
I'm right near Philly. Yeah, I'm about like 40 minutes away.
Okay, I've been to that one a couple of years ago. I went to the Philly card show, and that's a popular one.
It is.
All right. Lastly, let's see here. We had. Let me just go back through kind of our topics here. Let's go back a little bit to graded video games, graded comic books.
Absolutely.
Because we saw, and again, this is really no different than sports cards, the all-time highs, end of 2020, 2021, 2022, of course, with a lot of the spec money, a lot of the free flowing, the money flowing into the market, the stimulus money was a flowing. Where do you think we've seen really kind of a flattening out? There are certain, now granted, certain comic books, certain games, there's always kind of exceptions to this rule, still all-time highs that are happening. But these markets really have kind of, what I've seen anyway, have flattened out with graded video games, graded comic books. Do you see these as opportunities right now? Or is it still kind of more of like, wait and see, will it go down a little bit more? Could there be better buys? How are you kind of operating, with those two?
I'm taking a wait and see attitude, but if I find something that I say, hey, this is really selling for a significant discount in the overall market, then I'll pounce on it. But overall, I will tell you, and again, this is not political at all, but what's happening in the economy with tariffs, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And I think that's also going to eventually cycle its way through the antiques and collectibles trade. Now, obviously, if you're buying low value items, if you're buying factory seal booster boxes of modern era Pokemon cards that you're getting at retail, this most likely isn't going to affect you. This will run its course. But I do think that people need to be cautious if you are tying up serious sums of money in certain more markets that have hit a downturn or markets that may not be as robust as others. Let me word it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I've had a challenge with, and some of my friends, and I'm sure I have to assume that you're probably in the same boat, is, collectibles for a lot of the stuff that I've been buying, they haven't really seen any sort of a dip or a downturn, but what has dipped is the stock market. So, when I'm looking at my opportunity cost, for me, I've just had to go double down on particular stocks that I like. And even Bitcoin, I know it's highly speculative, not financial advice. Do whatever you want, viewers. This is not any sort of financial advice. But with Bitcoin pulling back pretty hard, I bought in a little bit more Bitcoin because it was kind of like, if you're trying to put, we just don't see that many dips like we've seen, especially in the S&P, or when you're looking at like the chart has kind of been like this for a while, really. I mean, hell, if you go back 15 years, really, like we've had very low interest rates. The market has really been kind of going upward. So anytime there's any sort of a downturn, and it doesn't matter what we're talking about here, if real estate does the same thing, then that would be something else I would look at. We haven't seen that quite yet. And I think kind of to what you're saying, your point is that if there's a graded comic book crash and everything is selling for pennies on the dollar, then I'm looking harder at that market. If there's key books that are, all of a sudden dipping, but we haven't really seen that. At least I haven't yet, for graded comic books, graded games, or, a lot of the sports card stuff. So I'm being really choosy. Whereas I've been just putting more money into kind of just doubling down on S&P stuff. If there's some individual stocks I like, it seems like that's really kind of where, for me personally, that's where I've been focused here over the last couple of months.
Correct. And that's definitely the more prudent strategy rather than right now trying to find deals in the collectible space. I will say that. Yeah. Because if you dollar cost into the market and you're buying right now, I keep saying this, and again, this is not political, but let's be realistic. 5 years from now, no one is going to care what happened in April of 2025. It's going to be a blip on a screen, just like I keep saying to my critics, because I invest heavily in S&P 500. I invest heavily in index funds. And I always have people tell me, well, Shawn, oh my God, look at the volatility in the market. And I have to go, well, go back and look what happened with COVID. It's a dot on a screen somewhere. And if you would have bought in when the market was down, you would have reaped the rewards when the market came back up. So that's really what I preach. And I hate to say this, I should say this, it's not investment advice, but really if you have the time horizon and you know what you're doing, it's very good investment advice if you can stomach the volatility.
Absolutely. The last topic I wanted to get to talk to you about, because you venture into a side that I'm not, I do kind of more of the pop culture, the collectible type stuff, the 80s, 90s stuff. That's kind of my emotions getting in. I like to, buy stuff that I love and all that stuff, the nostalgia. But you're also involved, and this is kind of more historical. I would call it historical collectibles, where it's currency, coins, antiques, old documents, and all these different things that you're buying into. What is that world looking like right now? Just like generalizing it, is it similar to what we see on the pop culture side, where everything is just kind of still pretty high priced? Is it still going up, or are you seeing some pullbacks on things to where there actually could be, in antiques and those sorts of things, buying opportunities?
The market that is on fire right now are coins and currency. Coins and currency is up across the board, and I consider that trend to be continuing, because usually what happens is when there's a pullback in the financial markets, precious metals tends to regain momentum. And a lot of people that come in and invest in precious metals, they then diversify into rare coins and currency.
Okay.
So it actually helps that market. Like if you would go back to the financial crisis that started in 2008, 2009. 2009 March is when the S&P 500 bottomed out. We didn't know it at the time, but that was pretty much the bottoming point of the financial crisis. If you look at what happened during the recovery, gold and silver started going up, specifically gold. And at that point in time, also the rare coin marketplace started to gain momentum as well. So what I like about coins and currency, it's automatically a diversification hedge. Now, the thing where I tell people to be cautious in this market is if we do hit a recession or, heaven forbid, a depression, In the beginning of that, what's going to happen is there's going to be a pullback in that market because people are going to be afraid to spend money on collectible coins and currency. But when that market starts to recover, those markets tend to do very well and they come back very strong, and usually they overheat. Even during COVID, coins and currency were going through the roof.
Now, are coins and currency, are they setting all-time highs just in general now compared to COVID, or did it do the same thing where it was like COVID boom and then it came back down and then it's kind of coming back, or how is that trajectory?
There was pretty much a 10 to 20% pullback across the board, but now we're seeing it heat up again. Okay. So it's very interesting how that, so it kind of followed the way that collectibles were going. People were stuck indoors. People got free government money, whether it was the stimulus check or the PPP loans that they didn't have to pay back. And it all ended up in that market. One thing I will tell you, the reason why there's a lot of demand for coins and currency over even other such antiques across the board is because, number one, they can be third-party graded. And number two, they're inherently more liquid. Okay. So a lot of people that are building like a portfolio of antiques, they'll definitely want to include coins and currency for that reason. Then they'll branch out. So if you have an interest in rare books, manuscripts, coins and currency, you're going to build a collection and all of that, but you're probably going to start with coins and currency from an investment standpoint because it's the most liquid and it's easiest also to get involved with because it can be third-party graded. Any other type of antique, there's a learning curve there where the barrier to entry is a little bit higher. So in other words, if somebody wants to go to the market and they want to buy a pack of Pokemon cards, we see this all the time on the internet. They can technically tell us, they can tell themselves that they're an investor. And technically, you know, you can laugh at them, but in all actuality, they're doing nothing different than what somebody like Rudy with Alpha Investments is doing, except on a larger scale.
Yep.
When it comes to any type of antique, anything where there's no third-party grading or there's a significant learning curve, the barrier to entry is exponentially high. So a lot of participants that get into that market, a lot of them, I hate to say this, they'll lose the proverbial ass if they don't know what they're doing. So that's the problem when we compare antiques to collectibles. Collectibles by their nature have a very low barrier to entry.
With currency in particular, is there certain currency that's more rare than another, and that's what kind of draws the interest, or is it like older the better? You know, what typically pulls, you know, how do you gauge it?
It's not so much the rarer the better, because when we look at the currency market, there's obsolete currency collecting. I could go off the rails on this. There's Confederate currency collecting. The market that is the most stable, that is in demand, is typically the market for large size silver certificates and gold certificates. And then everything else pretty much coalesces around that market. And that's pretty much the most popular market. Most people who get into currency collecting usually start with silver certificates and gold certificates. And usually, if you want to go after the investment grade stuff, the museum pieces, it's the large size stuff. Now that typically is the older stuff. But that's even more popular than like the older, like colonial currency.
Yeah.
If you look at like the popularity of collecting, when we break down the currency market, any type of silver certificates, gold certificates, they're always at the top. So that has the most collector appeal. And to be fair, if you've ever held or if you know anything about those notes, they're also some of the most beautiful notes ever created in the history of the United States. So
do you have any of those?
Oh yeah, I did a whole video on large size currency.
You've got some?
Oh yeah. I hold a massive position in that. I love
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. I kind of wonder, this is going to, okay, so I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, or ask kind of a side question on that, because we're talking about kind of American history, just in what we're talking about, that stuff. We saw, I think it was a heritage auction where, was it the Wizard of Oz, the slippers sold for $32 million, like one of four, not even a one of one, but one of four that are known. But to me, again, like it's kind of going back to the origins of Hollywood and movies, and kind of there's an American history element to it. Movie prop stuff, that's not a brand new market. I mean, it's been around and people have always, well, I don't want to say always, but people have spent money on that stuff over time. Because I remember just seeing it in the news over time. But that in particular feels like a market, again, just like with a lot of these collectible spaces. I don't know if the top 0.01% just has so much money that they just have, you know, it's like they're just finding all sorts of different things they want to spend money on. And maybe it's more of a global market now, you know, to where with these auction houses, they've got, you know, just more customers worldwide than maybe they did 20 or 30 years ago.
They
But with the movie prop stuff or TV, kind of that nostalgia stuff, do you see that as a a market? And again, it probably just depends on, how many of like, how do you gauge a market like that? Because it just feels like a lot of these are just one-off type, whether it be a TV show or a movie. How do you gauge, any sort of, value around that? I know we can't gauge like future value, but if you're trying to consult somebody and they're like, hey, Shawn, I'm thinking about getting into like movie prop stuff, like where do you even start with something like that?
It depends on what their budget is. And you also have to look at the historical significance of the movie in question and also the rarity of the piece. Like I'll use this as a great example. I don't know if you watch Pawn Stars.
Yep.
There was an episode of Pawn Stars where a person brought in a coconut cup that was used on the set of Gilligan's Island. Now, obviously, an item like that is going to have limited appeal. I honestly, if someone came to me and said, I'm going to invest in movie props, I want that piece, I would steer them away from that. Unless if you're getting it at a very low price and you can find another Gilligan's Island enthusiast collector that's going to pay a premium for that, that's not going to have the caliber of going after, say, an original Star Wars prop.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, Star Wars stuff.
Or even use this as an example, what we already brought up, the ruby slippers from Wizard of Oz. Even though there's 4 pair out there, obviously that's an iconic film. So when we look at movie memorabilia, especially prop collectibles, the significance and the impact of the film in question and the longevity of that film or franchise makes all the difference. Yeah. And then also, of course, the budget of the person who's buying that piece. Because let's be realistic. If you come to me and you say, Shawn, I have a budget of $10,000 only, you're not going to get an original screen used prop from an original Star Wars film. It's just not going to happen in most cases.
Do you know, do they have, because obviously we know that there's, we mentioned Beckett and, PSA kind of doing authentication for autographs and those sorts of things. Are there movie prop, are there authenticators that can say like, yeah, that was screen used, or how do you gauge, do you know if there's kind of third-party authenticators for that stuff?
I do know sometimes, like when we talk about signatures, they can be verified. Normally, the way that we will look as experts in the trade, if something was screen used, we will try to compare it to like photos of the piece and also match it on screen to see if we can verify that it was used. Believe it or not, some movie studios did keep elegant records where that's pretty much confirmed through provenance or through the people that are still alive, whether it be the director or the actor or the actress. Yes, this was used. We can confirm this is the piece.
Okay.
So it can be hit and miss. It's not as a factual, I don't want to say science because third-party grading is really based as an art form, but it's not an exact science like third-party grading, but there's clues that you can use to pretty much be 90% sure, sometimes almost 100.
Okay.
It just depends on the piece in question. For instance, I do know, I believe it was Han Solo's blaster came up for bid I think it was a couple of years back that sold for significant sum. That was verified by not only Harrison Ford, but I think George Lucas, even other people on the set. This was used on screen. So that's how they had provenance for that to fetch the amount of money that it fetched. Because usually with movie props, I'll just give you this piece of history. Usually they make more than one.
Yeah.
So what'll happen is a lot of these other pieces will get out and people will be like, oh, this was used on screen. And really we know it wasn't. They're just stating that to try to increase the value of it. So you do have to be careful. I do know, I think, if I remember correctly, Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yep.
There were multiple pairs of his razor glove that he wears.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But only, I think, 1 or 2 were used on screen for some of the original movies.
Yeah.
So those other pieces are out there. You just have to be careful because if somebody tells you it's on screen, that's where you really have to check the provenance and be sure.
Yeah, it's like on set versus on screen or whatever. If you can, because even on set would be cool, but at least, but you want to know that before buying it, obviously.
Correct, because sometimes they make these pieces and they just sit in the back room. They're never even worn by the actor or anything, and it's like, well, what's the point in owning that?
Right. All right, I have one more question, and this is an important one because I think that it's. I've heard different people talk about it. High-end collectors, buyers talk about this when we're comparing art versus collectibles, and maybe I guess antiques too.
Sure.
A lot of pushback on, and this is mostly in the sports card space when you're talking about a $10 million sports card or $5 million sports card. We've heard just from a tax standpoint, art has a much, there's a lot of tax advantages to having art. You can use art as collateral. You can take out a loan against your art. A lot of the argument against kind of like comparing sports cards to art is, well, these are different things. You can actually borrow against, art, whereas, and talking about expensive art versus like with sports cards, you can't use them as collateral. Like the bank doesn't care about your sports cards. Now, maybe that's, case by case. I'm not exactly sure, but art, you're an art person as well. Do you have any takes on, and we're not tax experts, but I figured we could kind of just talk about it in general.
I can tell you how this works perfectly. Well, first, let me back up a little bit, because people somehow have this idea, and I'm not saying you. I mean, I have people that come to me even through the comment section on my channel. They think that if they have a piece of art or even a graded collectible, that somewhere in the back of their mind, they think that they can walk into a bank and a bank is going to give them a loan based on the value of that item, meaning collateralize that item.
Right.
And I keep having to correct people. Banks are not in the antiques and collectibles business. They don't know a Rembrandt from a mass-produced Pokemon card from 2005 that may in PSA 10 sell for thousands of dollars just because the market's on fire right now. So where we have to kind of step back here, there are certain items in the entire antiques, art, antiquities, collectibles trade that, yes, you can collateralize. But normally how you do it is you would go to like an auction company like Heritage or Hakes or Morphe, Sotheby's, Christie's, take your pick. And if you consign that item and you need money, what'll more than likely happen is, first of all, in most cases, the auction company would probably offer you a consignment loan based on the value of that piece. But if not, you could get a written appraisal and you could take that to the bank, but the bank's going to say, okay, you need to liquidate this piece. That's what happens in most cases. Now, there are companies out there, for instance, if you collect graded coins and currency, there are companies that advertise in a lot of magazines that are put out in that hobby in those periodicals, like Coin World's one, there's others, that they will advertise. You can send them a graded coin or currency that's worth X number of dollars, and you can take a loan against it, almost like a pawn shop.
Okay.
For high-end art, that's a different world, because most of those people that are playing in that market, especially when we talk about pieces of art that sell six figures or more, so starting at like 100,000 all the way up to millions, to tens of millions, to hundreds of millions of dollars, there are a lot of high financiers that just do, because of the fact the person has a lot of money, they will take that particular piece as collateral and they will lend the money. But that is not the norm. That's why I have to laugh. Like, people will watch Pawn Stars, and some people out there, they just don't know how the antiques and collectibles trade works. So they think if they walk into a pawn shop, it's the pawn shop's job to call in an expert and realistically appraise the item. That's not what pawn shops do. I know you know this, but some of your audience may not. What happens is it's your job to state how much you think the item's worth. Whether or not they agree with you, they'll negotiate a price and they'll ask you, okay, do you want to sell it or do you want to borrow against it? And typically it's not wise to use collectibles as collateral, because most of these companies across the board, they charge extremely high interest rates. It is beneficial. I remember, as a matter of fact, if you read the book Killer Stuff and Tons of Money, this story is in it. I think it was Vincent, the guy who owns Metropolis Comics. There was a house that was being foreclosed on, and actually it was in my state of Pennsylvania. I think it was on the other side of the state. And the family found a copy of Action Comics 1.
Nice.
And it just happened where they had a lot of bad luck. The husband lost his job. The wife was crying. They were really upset. They thought they were going to lose the house. And they found this rare comic book. And they were able to at least call up Vincent. They knew enough to do research. They got in touch with him. And he was able, because he owns an auction company, to call the bank and say, hey, this comic book I can certify is worth this much. They're going to be selling it. Can we at least hold off the foreclosure until it sells, and we can sum up what we owe you then and save the house? And it worked out in that regard. But that was because he also owned an auction company. He was also responsible for selling it. So he could pretty much satisfy the bank out of the proceeds of that sale.
Okay. Gotcha.
So collateralization, when we talk about antiques and collectibles, it's a little bit more complex than people leave on. It's very hard to take an illiquid asset and make it liquid in these markets. It's easier to do it when markets are running hot. Like right now, if we look at the Pokemon market, if we look at other markets, sports cards, if you have this stuff, yes, there's always going to be a buyer. But taking a loan against these assets is usually not recommended. Again, usually when you're in the high-end art market, you're dealing with people that are educated in finance and they have a lot of other assets.
Yeah. Well, and we saw too, just from a corporate standpoint doing this, PWCC, they basically, I mean, they ended up selling to Fanatics because of loans against cards that ended up going belly up. So that makes total sense. I mean, it's risky on all sides.
It's almost akin to like buying stocks on margin or playing in options.
Yeah.
I can tell you stories. I mean, I can tell personal anecdotes where people have come to me and they have inherited a massive art collection. But the problem is they don't have any liquid capital. So it's very interesting seeing the position and the emotions and the decision-making that they take on that part, because it's like, well, I don't want to part with these pieces, because then there are people in the trade that will lend you money against them. But the problem is if you have no cash flow, what good is a loan against the piece if the interest rate is like 12%?
Right.
And you have no cash flow already because you don't want to let go of the piece. It's going to be a bloodbath. Eventually you're going to bleed out.
Yep. Yeah. No, makes sense. All right, man. We are a little bit over time. Shawn, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. I promise it won't be 2 more years before I call back out again to have you on. I really enjoy these talks. If you want to find Shawn, he's over at Reserved Investments on YouTube, of course. Anything else that you want to shout out as far as staying in contact with you, Shawn?
No, you can reach out to me. If you do want to either just email me or use my consulting services, you can reach out to me at Reserved Investments, all one word, @gmail.com. So you can connect with me. I'm very active in the antiques and collectibles trade. I also should state this. I do write for Antiques and Auction News. My articles premiere every 2 weeks on a bi-weekly basis at www.antiquesandauctionnews.net.
All right. Awesome. Shawn, thanks again, man. We will see you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you for having me.
Talk to you later.